Marriage is supposed to represent safety, a promise, a bond built on trust, loyalty, and the quiet belief that no matter how difficult life becomes, the person beside you is the one person who never truly becomes your enemy. But for some, that promise turns into something else entirely. Because behind a wedding photograph, behind a family home, behind a smiling couple standing shoulder to shoulder, there can sometimes exist a private reality so dark, so manipulative, and so violent that the final act does not end in divorce, but in death. In tonight's video, we will be looking at 3 deeply unsettling cases involving wives who were accused or convicted of killing their husbands. These are not stories of split-second rage alone. They are stories of obsession, deception, humiliation, fear, control, and in some cases, horrifying brutality. One case became a media spectacle that fascinated the entire United States. Another left investigators arguing for years over whether it was murder or self-preservation. And the final case was so grotesque, so shocking, that it permanently altered criminal history in Australia. So, dim the lights, settle in, and as always, listen closely. Because sometimes the person sleeping beside you is not your partner. Sometimes, they are the danger. For many people, marriage is seen as the ultimate commitment. 2 lives become one. Dreams are shared. Families are built. And the home becomes a place where vulnerability is meant to be safe. But when resentment begins to grow behind closed doors, when secrets enter the relationship, or when one person starts seeing the other as an obstacle rather than a loved one, marriage can become something terrifying. The 3 cases in this video are disturbing for very different reasons. In one, a young woman was accused of manipulating teenage boys into killing her husband. In another, a suburban mother claimed she was a victim of years of abuse, while prosecutors insisted she had carefully staged a savage murder. And in the last, a woman with a long and violent history committed an act so infamous that it still horrifies people decades later. This is not a celebration of violence. It is an examination of how relationships can decay into something monstrous. And with that said, let us begin with one of the most notorious cases of them all. When people think of crimes that became media sensations before the modern internet era, the name Pamela Smart is one that still resurfaces. Partly because of the crime itself, partly because of the age gap and scandal surrounding the affair at the center of it, and partly because even decades later, the case continues to provoke debate about guilt, manipulation, and responsibility. Pamela Wojcik, later known as Pamela Smart, was born in Florida in 1967. She eventually married Gregory Smart, and on the surface, the pair appeared to be building a normal life together in New Hampshire. But that image would not last. By 1990, Pamela was a young school media coordinator, and according to reporting on the case, she had begun an affair with a 15-year-old boy, William Flynn. That relationship would soon become central to one of the most infamous murder cases in the country. On the 1st of May 1990, Gregory Smart was found shot to death in the couple's condominium in Derry, New Hampshire. At first glance, the scene seemed to suggest a burglary gone wrong, but it did not take investigators long to begin questioning whether the truth was something far more deliberate. As detectives examined Gregory's murder, attention turned toward Pamela's affair with the teenage boy. Prosecutors would later argue that William Flynn had been persuaded to kill Gregory and that Pamela had helped set the plot in motion. According to later reporting, Flynn told authorities that Pamela wanted her husband dead because she feared losing everything in a divorce. He said she pressured him, and that her influence over him was central to the murder plot. The crime was not carried out by Flynn alone. Other teenagers became involved as well, and as the case widened, investigators began piecing together a web of planning, manipulation, and secrecy. One of the most critical parts of the investigation involved a friend of Pamela's who cooperated with police. As suspicion intensified, authorities used recorded conversations to help build the case against her. Eventually, Pamela Smart was arrested and charged. What followed was a trial that captured enormous public attention. This was not just a murder case. It was a scandal, an older woman, a teenage lover, a dead husband, a courtroom full of competing narratives. To the prosecution, Pamela was the architect, a woman who used seduction, influence, and emotional leverage to push a teenage boy into murder. To the defense, the prosecution was exaggerating her role and turning a deeply messy affair into a simple story of a calculating mastermind. Pamela admitted the affair. That part was never truly in doubt. But she denied plotting Gregory's murder. The distinction mattered, because in a case like this, the central question was never only who pulled the trigger. It was who truly set the killing in motion. In 1991, Pamela Smart was convicted as an accomplice to first-degree murder, along with conspiracy and witness tampering charges, and was sentenced to life without parole. For years afterward, she maintained that she had not been responsible in the way prosecutors claimed. The case remained controversial in the public imagination, in part because it seemed to capture a cultural obsession with sex, power, and televised justice. And then, decades later, there was a shift. In a 2024 report, Pamela Smart publicly accepted responsibility for Gregory's death for the first time, saying that after years of deflecting blame, she had come to recognize how responsible she truly was. Even then, however, not everyone believed the statement resolved the long-running questions surrounding the case. That is part of what makes this case so enduring. Not simply the fact that Gregory Smart was murdered, but the way the case sits at the crossroads of criminal guilt and psychological influence. How much responsibility belongs to the person who physically commits a murder? How much belongs to the person accused of planting the idea, feeding the motive, and emotionally steering others toward violence? Pamela Smart's case never stopped being about more than just one night. It became about persuasion, about manipulation, about the terrifying possibility that someone does not need to wield the weapon to become the most dangerous person in the room. And for Gregory Smart, none of the later debate changes the ending. He was a young man whose life ended inside his own home, while the person closest to him became forever linked to the crime. That is what makes the case so chilling. Not only the betrayal, but the possibility that the murder may have begun long before the shot was ever fired. If the Pamela Smart case is remembered as a story of manipulation and planning, the next case is remembered for something else entirely. Its violence, its bloodshed, and the question that split public opinion for years. Was this a cold, calculated murder, or was it the desperate act of a woman who believed she would die if she did not fight back? In January of 2003, investigators in Harris County, Texas, uncovered a crime scene that was almost impossible to forget. A man named Jeff Wright had been killed. His body had been buried in the backyard of the home he shared with his wife, Susan Wright. And when the details came out, the case quickly became one of the most widely discussed crimes in Texas. According to reporting and court records, Jeff Wright had been stabbed more than 190 times. The number alone was enough to make national headlines. Susan Wright was by many accounts a suburban mother. She and Jeff had children. They lived what, from the outside, may have appeared to be a normal family life. But once Jeff was dead, two radically different versions of the marriage began to emerge. According to prosecutors, Susan Wright tied her husband to the bed and stabbed him in a deliberate attack. Afterward, she buried his body in the backyard, attempted to clean the bedroom with bleach and paint, and then even filed a domestic abuse complaint against the man who was already dead. To the state, this was not self-defense, it was staging. It was murder followed by concealment. Susan's version was very different. She claimed she had endured abuse, and that what happened in that bedroom was an act of self-preservation. In later legal proceedings, evidence was discussed relating to her claim that Jeff had assaulted her and threatened her with a knife, leading to a violent struggle. This is what made the case so divisive. The physical facts were horrific. Jeff Wright died from an extraordinary number of stab wounds. The body was hidden. Evidence appeared to have been cleaned. All of that made Susan look deeply culpable. And yet, the defense argued that the marriage had been abusive, that Jeff had a violent side, and that Susan's actions could not be understood without looking at the years that allegedly came before the killing. At her 2004 trial, the prosecution portrayed her as a scheming wife, motivated by money and escape. The defense argued that she was a battered woman who had finally snapped under terror and trauma. The courtroom itself became part of the story. One of the most infamous moments in the trial came when the prosecution staged a dramatic demonstration involving the bed, attempting to show the ferocity and time required to commit such an attack. It was the kind of courtroom theater that burns itself into public memory. And for many watching, the question became less about whether Susan had killed Jeff, because that much was not really in dispute, and more about why. Why did it happen? Was this months or years of resentment ending in violence? Was it a planned killing disguised as domestic victimhood? Or was it a panicked explosion in a home where danger had been building silently? The jury in 2004 found Susan Wright guilty of murder and sentenced her to 25 years in prison. But the case did not end there. Appeals followed, and one of the major arguments raised afterward was that the defense at trial had not adequately presented evidence connected to battered woman syndrome and abuse allegations. Eventually, Susan Wright won a new punishment trial, though not a new determination of guilt. At that later proceeding, the case again forced jurors to confront two versions of reality. Investigators' theory painted the murder as a controlled attack, followed by concealment. But medical and legal arguments introduced further complexity. Questions were raised about whether some aspects of the original prosecution theory fully matched the physical evidence. The law also required jurors to consider whether Susan acted under sudden passion. In the end, they did not accept that in a way that spared her from serious punishment. Her sentence was reduced from 25 years to 20 years. Later reporting stated that Susan Wright was ultimately paroled in 2020. This case lingers in the mind because it resists easy certainty. The facts are brutal. Jeff Wright died in a horrifying way. His body was buried. The scene was altered. But surrounding those facts is a cloud of competing claims about fear, violence, and what really happened in the final moments inside that bedroom. There are some true crime cases where the narrative seems obvious. This is not one of them. Instead, the Susan Wright case lives in that disturbing gray area where the public is forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes a killer claims survival. Sometimes a victim had been dangerous. Sometimes both things can exist in the same story. And sometimes, even after the verdict, people still cannot agree on what kind of crime they just witnessed. That uncertainty is what keeps this case alive. Because while the jury answered the legal question, the human question remains far harder. Was Susan Wright a calculating murderer, or a woman whose violence came after living too long in fear? Depending on who you ask, the answer changes. But Jeff Wright still ended up dead, buried in his own backyard, and that alone ensures the case will never be forgotten. The first case centered on manipulation, the second on a battle between murder and self-defense. But the final case goes beyond both. Because what happened in this one was not merely violent, it was monstrous. There are crimes so savage that they seem to leave the realm of ordinary criminal violence altogether. The case of Katherine Knight is one of them. Even now, years later, it remains one of the most horrifying murders in Australian history. Katherine Knight was born in New South Wales in 1955. Accounts of her earlier life describe a troubled upbringing, exposure to violence, and a pattern of aggression that would follow her into adulthood. She worked as a meat worker, and by all reports, she was highly skilled at it. That detail, on its own, would have meant very little to most people at the time. Later, it would become one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Over the years, Katherine had relationships marked by instability and violence. By the time she became involved with a man named John Price, she already had a troubling reputation. John Price was, according to reporting, well known in the local community. He had children. He worked hard. And those who knew him did not expect his life to end in the way it did. On the night of the 29th of February 2000, everything came to a horrific conclusion. According to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's reporting on the case and the sentencing judge's findings, Catherine Knight killed John Price in his home in Aberdeen, New South Wales. The post-mortem revealed that he had been stabbed at least 37 times. That, by itself, would have been enough to shock the country. But what happened after John Price died is what transformed the case into something almost impossible to comprehend. The sentencing findings described how Catherine Knight, using the expertise she had gained as a meat worker, mutilated his body in an appallingly methodical way. His body was skinned. His head was removed. Parts of his remains were cooked, and food was prepared and arranged in a manner that suggested his children may have been intended to encounter an unspeakable horror. It is difficult to talk about this case without sounding as though one is describing fiction, but it was horrifyingly real. The judge in the case made it clear that the cruelty involved was extreme. This was not a chaotic crime scene produced by sudden panic. It showed time, activity, and a level of post-mortem desecration that stunned investigators and scarred the community. And yet, what makes the story even more unsettling is that for some people around her, Catherine Knight's violent capacity had not emerged from nowhere. There had been warning signs, a history, a pattern, incidents that, in hindsight, seemed to point toward a person capable of catastrophic violence. That does not make what happened inevitable, but it does make it haunting, because it raises a recurring question in true crime. How many signs can exist before the worst finally happens? After the killing, Catherine Knight's case moved through the legal system, and eventually she became the first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Her file, according to reporting, is marked in a way that means she is never to be released. That historical detail matters, not simply because it shows the severity of the punishment, but because it reflects how extraordinary the crime itself was seen to be. There are murder cases that horrify because of betrayal, others because of greed, others because of cruelty. This one horrifies because it feels like all three, and then something beyond them. There is also another deeply tragic layer. John Price was not just a victim in an abstract legal case. He was a father, a member of a community, a man whose death left behind not only grief, but trauma of a kind that is difficult even to put into words. Local people reportedly never forgot the day the news broke, and it is easy to understand why. Some crimes are remembered because they remain unsolved, others because they reveal something unsettling about the criminal mind. But the Catherine Knight case is remembered because it crossed a line so extreme that it permanently entered the national consciousness. It became shorthand for a kind of violence people do not want to believe is possible. And perhaps the most disturbing part is that John Price appears to have known she could be dangerous. Reports on the broader history of the relationship have long suggested warning signs and fear. But as is so often the case in abusive or volatile relationships, danger does not always stop people from going back. Sometimes familiarity creates false hope. Sometimes people believe they can manage the risk. Sometimes they think the worst will not happen to them. In this case, it did. And when police and the community were left to confront the scene, what they found ensured that Catherine Knight would never be remembered as merely another murderer. She became something else in public memory, a symbol of absolute domestic horror. A reminder that intimacy can sometimes place a victim closer to evil than anyone else on earth. These three cases are disturbing for different reasons, but they all force us to confront the same uncomfortable truth. Marriage does not erase danger. A wedding ring does not guarantee loyalty. A shared home does not guarantee safety. And love, once twisted by manipulation, control, greed, fear, or rage, can become one of the most lethal forces imaginable. In Pamela Smart's case, the horror lies in alleged influence and betrayal. In Susan Wright's case, it lies in uncertainty, brutality, and the blurred line between victimhood and violence. And in Catherine Knight's case, it lies in a level of cruelty almost beyond comprehension. If these stories show us anything, it is that the most terrifying crimes are often not committed by strangers. They are committed by the people who know their victims best, the people who have shared their routines, their homes, their beds, their secrets. And that is what makes these cases so hard to shake. Because they remind us that sometimes the deadliest threat in a person's life is not lurking in the dark outside. Sometimes it is already inside the house,